Hello, and welcome to the Joy of Drafting. I'm Travis Semulin Sowers. When a new Magic set comes out, many content creators, including myself, will release set reviews and put together tier lists. These reviews and lists are to tell you which cards in a set the reviewer thinks are good and how early you should pick them in draft. While these tools can be useful for getting a head start on a new format, they aren't actually helping you become better at drafting or showing you how to evaluate cards on your own. Today, I want to teach you about Quadrant Theory. If you watch my set review for Theros or read another content creator's tier list for Theros, you can sit down and draft Theros. If you understand Quadrant Theory, you can show up at a game store where a draft of Triple Ice Age is about to start and feel confident signing up without having any idea what's in the set. Quadrant Theory states that within each game of Magic draft, you will generally find yourself in one of four situations. The early game, when you and your opponent are curving out, situations where you are ahead, situations where you are behind, and board stalls, when you and your opponent are at parity. Let's elaborate on these states, and I think you'll find that they sound familiar. The early game is just asking how good is a card if you played it on the first turn you could cast it. A 2/2 for 2 mana or a 3/2 for 3 mana are good examples of cards you would want to play early. A 1/3 for 4 with an amazing activated ability that costs 8 mana is not so good when curving out. A situation when you're ahead is one where if nothing changes, you'll win the game in a few turns. Perhaps your opponent has a few good ground blockers, but you still have a 3/2 flyer getting in and they're at 10 life. Or maybe you have a board full of 1/1 tokens and your opponent has only a few blockers. The idea is that if no cards were played, you'd win the game. It's worth noting that the ahead quadrant is the least important. If you're already winning the game, most cards are at least okay. If a card is only good when you're ahead, it's likely not a great card. A situation where you're behind is the exact opposite. Your opponent will win the game in a few turns if you don't do something to stop them. A board stall, or a game state that has reached parity, is one where the game is not going to reach an obvious conclusion. Usually there are several ground creatures and neither of you have good attacks. It's possible you have a 1/2 flyer poking in for a bit of damage, or maybe your opponent is pinging you for one for a turn with a creature, but generally the game is set to drag on for a bit until an impactful card is played to break the stall. Understanding these four quadrants will allow you to evaluate cards on your own. Let's talk through a few examples of cards and how they play out with these four quadrants in mind. I'm going to use examples of cards that often show up in limited sets. These particular cards may not be in the current set, but the way we evaluate them will allow you to compare cards from any set. Try this on your own after the video with a few cards from whatever the current MTG draft set is. Let's start with Essence Scatter. 1 and a blue for an instant, counter target creature spell. On curve, this card is pretty good. It allows you to counter your opponent's 2 or 3 mana creature in the early game. When you're ahead, this card is fantastic. Your opponent isn't going to be able to play a blocker to stop your assault. When you're behind, this card is actually quite bad. I often hear new players say that Essence Scatter is like removal, and this quadrant shows why that is not true. If your opponent is connecting with a 4/4 flyer and you're at 12 life, Essence Scatter is not what you want to draw or have in hand. If you're at a board stall, this card is okay. It's not going to turn the stall in your favor, but it's going to make sure your opponent can't turn the stall with a creature spell. Essence Scatter is good on curve, good when you're ahead, okay when you're stalled, and bad when you're behind. That makes Essence Scatter a pretty good 2-mana card in most blue decks. We'll talk more about mana curves in the future, but note that it's not common to find a 2-mana play that's good on turn 2 and still impactful later. Not many cards that cost only 2 mana do much in the late game, and that makes Essence Scatter a solid pick. Let's talk about a few other cards and see how they stack up. Thoughtseize. Black. Target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card. You lose 2 life. On curve, turn 1, this card is likely the best thing you could be doing in any limited format. 2 life is a low price to pay to see exactly what your opponent is up to and take their best threat or removal spell. On curve, Thoughtseize is amazing! When you're ahead, Thoughtseize doesn't really do much. It's not likely your opponent has many cards that could change the board state, or they'd have used them already. When you're behind, Thoughtseize is actively bad. The 2 life becomes much more relevant, and you're far more interested in the cards your opponent has in play rather than the ones they have in hand. And on a board stall, Thoughtseize is rarely impactful. There's times when you can nab a removal spell, but many times at board stalls, your opponent has no cards in hand or just a land or two. From this example, we can see a card that excels when played on curve, but isn't so great when you draw it later. For this reason, in many of the formats where Thoughtseize has been printed, it's not often picked. Bringing in discard from your sideboard is an option, but that's a topic for another episode. If you've ever heard a good Limited player say they're not a huge fan of discard in Limited, this example may help you understand why. Next up is Ravenous Chupacabra. 2 black for a 2/2 that destroys target creature when it enters the battlefield. When played on curve, Ravenous Chupacabra is good, but this isn't often when you'd want to play it. Most removal spells, or creatures with removal attached, aren't something you want to play as soon as possible. Often, you want to save them to kill your opponent's key creature. That said, the fact that you can play this on turn 4 and still have it make an impact is not a bad thing. When you're ahead, Ravenous Chupacabra is almost as good a draw as it is fun to say. Chupacabra. Chupacabra. Not only are you winning on the board, you can now answer your opponent's next blocker. When you're behind, Ravenous Chupacabra is a wonderful draw. Kill the creature that had good attacks while adding power to your own board. And the Chupadupe also has a shot at breaking board stalls. If the board was stalled because your opponent had one large creature holding back your team, well, now they don't. You may have already known that a creature that kills one of your opponent's creatures is a good Magic card, but looking at it through the lens of Quadrant Theory shows you exactly why it is so good. Ravenous Chupacabra is never a bad card in any quadrant and is actively good in 3 of the quadrants. Let's take a look at one more card to drive the concept home. Inspiring Unicorn. 2 white for a 2/2. When this creature attacks, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Again, this card is unlikely to be in the set you're currently drafting, but some kind of small creature that pumps other attackers when it attacks is seen in most sets. When you're curving out, this card is okay. Assuming you had a turn 2 and turn 3 play, this will likely enable you to keep attacking. If you're ahead, this card is usually very good, as it will allow you to slam the door shut on your opponent's chance at catching up. If you're behind, this card is usually quite bad. It's only able to pump your team on attacks, not blocks, and its stat line is not great for the mana you're spending. If you're at a board stall, this card is often not good enough. It can make swinging with your team a good idea if your opponent's life total is low enough, but it isn't going to break a board stall on its own. Inspiring Unicorn is a good example of a card that looks good in theory, but often underperforms. You could certainly build a deck around the idea of curving into it, that is, make a very aggressive or aggro deck, but in most Limited decks, this Unicorn is a bit uninspiring. If you take some time and evaluate cards on your own, you'll come to realize that most cards are good when you're ahead. You'll also soon realize that many of the cards that good Limited players value are cards that are very good when you're behind. This is actually the most important of the quadrants. Cards that will get you out of a bad situation are ones that you should value highly. Many removal spells fall into this category, and it's one of the reasons why there's such a high pick and draft. By focusing on cards that are good when you're behind, you can make sure that you can handle any situation that comes at you. Quadrant Theory was first introduced by the Limited Resources podcast, hosted by Marshall Sutcliffe and Brian Wong. In the description of this video, I've linked episode 248 of Limited Resources, where they introduce the concept. I'd recommend you give it a listen if you'd like to deep dive on the subject. There's a lot that Quadrant Theory doesn't cover, like synergy in a set and cards that don't fit neatly into the 4 quadrants, but you have to learn the rules before you decide to break them. Don't worry, there's plenty more episodes of The Joy of Drafting coming your way, and we'll cover those concepts in the future. Look at a few cards from the current Magic set and see what quadrants they are good in. You'll be able to see the good cards in any pack without the need of a set review or a tier list. Set reviews are still a good way to check in on the speed of a format and see potential synergies, but an understanding of the fundamentals, like Quadrant Theory, are tools you can use for any format. Thank you for watching today's episode. Please take a moment to like the video and tell a friend about the series. I'm very excited to teach the concepts of draft and share the joy of drafting with my fellow Magic players. This is my passion project, until I get a sponsor. I'll see you next time, and until then, I hope all of your Chupacabras are ravenous.